The United States won World War II. I think that's common knowledge, and if you don't think that that is common knowledge, well, I'm sorry to break it to you. On February 13, 1938, Strassman and his assistant Ida Noddack bombarded a small sample of uranium with neutrons. Not even Einstein was sure whether nuclear fission was even possible. It wasn't until Albert Speer came along that Germany really began investing heavily into nuclear research. By 1942, Germany had set up the Uranverein, a secret organization dedicated to producing the atomic bomb. They had managed to produce a few grams of plutonium-239, but it was far from enough to build a bomb. As the war situation grew increasingly desperate, it became clear that the Uranverein was going to need outside help. That's because during the invasion, British commandos attacked and sank 3 German U-boats filled with German scientists, including Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, who was working on a different method of producing plutonium. This would have been a major blow to the German war effort, but luckily, the scientists were able to escape. They would have targeted a city like London or Washington, D.C., killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. But this is where our timeline diverges. People around the world would have been horrified by the sheer destructive capability of the weapon. Most Americans still believe that the bombings were necessary to end the war, but the rest of the world saw it differently. The Japanese had surrendered unconditionally. There was no need to kill hundreds of thousands of innocent people. But the genie was out of the bottle now. No one could put the world back in the box. In America, there were widespread calls for the immediate dropping of the remaining German bombs on Berlin and every major German city. Mutually assured destruction became the order of the day, and the world teetered on the edge of annihilation. But if the atomic weapon hadn't been used on Japan, would the world have been any different? He would frequently change the direction of the program, often for no good reason. But if Hitler had stepped back and allowed the scientists to get on with their work, then it's entirely possible that Germany could have developed the bomb first. In fact, it's entirely possible that the Cold War could have been fought between Germany and the United States. Well, yes and no. All the Cold War did was delay the inevitable. Eventually, someone was going to use the bomb again. There are actually 2 scenarios that could have played themselves out, but President Truman couldn't risk the lives of American soldiers needed to take Berlin. But if the Germans had beat them to the punch, then the United States would have been the ones playing catch-up. This would have made it much harder for them to dominate the early years of the Cold War. In this scenario, it's likely that the Soviet Union would have become the preeminent superpower in the world. But this isn't the only option. So he ordered that the bombs be thrown back into the sea. But that wasn't the end of it. Public pressure mounted, and soon Truman was ordered to drop the bombs on Japan instead. But what's not impossible is liking this video if you haven't done so already. It helps me out a lot. And if you want to see more of my videos, then you should subscribe. Thanks for watching. Because of the nature of the beast, the use of the atomic weapon against either Germany or the Allies would immediately escalate the conflict to a whole new level. While conventional weapons kill relatively small numbers of people, nukes wipe entire cities off the map. The use of the atomic weapon in World War II would not only have changed the outcome of the war, it would have changed the world forever. They would eventually make it back to Germany and play key roles in building the first German atomic bombs. It was at this point that Hitler decided to put his faith in Werner Heisenberg. The Germans would go on to produce several more bombs, but it was too late. The war was lost and the bombs were never used. But what if they had been? Well, it's difficult to say. The biggest threat posed by the atomic weapon was the devastation caused by the blast and the subsequent radiation sickness. Survivors of the bombing of Hiroshima estimated that about 75% of the city's buildings had been destroyed, and most of the remainder were rendered uninhabitable by radiation. Survivors suffering from radiation sickness had only a 10% chance of surviving the initial burst. Even those who survived the blast and sickness would face a lifetime of health issues. Heisenberg was working on an alternative method of producing plutonium, but he would need a lot more time to complete his work. In order to speed things up, Hitler decided to deploy him to one of Germany's occupied territories. Working under the auspices of the German military, the Uranverein would pool together scientists from across the country, including Werner Heisenberg, Max von Laue, and many more. Meanwhile, in the United States, physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer would be appointed to oversee the Manhattan Project. So while there was plenty of uranium available, it would be some time before anyone knew how to properly harness its power. In Germany, though, the war was taking its toll on morale, and the Uranverein struggled to attract new talent. Many of the best German scientists had already been lost to the war effort. Bohr told Heisenberg that Denmark had recently been occupied by the British, and that they had taken much of Denmark's radium supply with them. Radium was needed to produce the neutrons required to induce nuclear fission. Without it, the British wouldn't be able to develop the bomb, and so Heisenberg came up with a plan. He convinced Hitler to allow him to lead a German invasion of Iceland. He told the Führer that not only would this secure the valuable supply of hydrofluoric acid in Iceland, which was needed to process uranium, but that it would also tie up a large number of British troops. Hitler bought it, and the Germans took Iceland, securing Bohr's valuable resources. They had been given positions in the military where their talents could be better used. However, as the war dragged on, the German military began to lose faith in the Uranverein. They began to see the project as nothing more than a pipe dream. But Hitler remained hopeful. He was convinced that the British were close to developing the bomb, and he wanted to keep pace with them. By 1939, however, the race was on. The United States and Nazi Germany, along with Britain and France, all began investing heavily into nuclear research. The Tube Alliance team immediately reported their discovery to the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, which informed both the French and German governments. But while the French were quick to see the potential military applications of nuclear power, the Germans thought that such a weapon was nonsense. The experiment was successful, producing several different radioactive isotopes, including the first artificial element, neptunium. Although neither Strassmann nor Nadok knew it at the time, they had just split an atom. The feat wouldn't be officially recognized until a few months later, when the Tube Alliance team realized that neptunium could be produced from the neutron bombardment of uranium. They called their discovery uranium fission. It was the first time that nuclear fission had ever been artificially induced. But the Allied forces did defeat the Axis powers in the Second World War. But what if they hadn't? What if the Third Reich had been the first nation to develop the atomic weapon? What if Hitler had launched the first ever atomic attack? Well, let's find out. This is another alternate history video. And by 1938, German scientists were hard at work trying to replicate the feat of the so-called Tube Alliance. It's a secret research project headed by physicists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann. But this discovery was something of a fluke, and no one really understood what had happened or even why it had worked. In fact, Hitler himself would go on record saying, "I consider the possibility of constructing such a bomb as extremely improbable, bordering on the ridiculous." And in Britain, a top-secret effort was being mounted under the direction of physicist John Cockcroft and Lord Louis Mountbatten. But after 5 years of intensive work, the Uranverein had come up with very little. There Heisenberg met with the Danish physicist H. Bohr, son of Man Bohr, who was one of the leading experts on nuclear fission. It was a major victory for the Germans, but it was almost a disaster. It took another 2 years, but in 1945, Germany successfully tested the world's first atomic weapon. If the Germans had developed the bomb first, it's likely that they would have used it in the same way. For starters, the public reaction to an atomic attack on a major city would have been devastating. The Japanese surrender unconditionally, ending World War II. But this victory was tainted by the horror of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Over the next few decades, every major power on Earth would invest heavily in their own nuclear program. First of all, the use of the atomic weapon on Japan in our timeline gave the United States a massive technological edge over its rivals. As we saw earlier, the German nuclear program was beset by delays and setbacks. This was mainly due to Hitler's constant meddling. So who would have won? Well, that's impossible to say.